The world remembers the flood as an ending, rain without mercy. Waters rose until every mountain lost its name. A silence afterward was so complete that even memory seemed washed clean. And yet some memories do not drown. Across ancient traditions, whispers remain, not shouted, not celebrated, but preserved like hairline cracks in stone. Stories suggesting that when the waters receded, something old still breathed, something too heavy to be swept away, something the flood did not finish. The Nephilim were meant to belong to the world before, beings of impossible stature and troubling origin, born at the intersection of heaven's rebellion and earth's vulnerability. The flood, we are told, was the divine answer, a reset, a cleansing of corruption so deep it had entered bone and blood. But what if the cleansing was not total? What if survival was not failure, but design? Ancient texts do not shout this possibility. They circle it. They gesture toward it with careful language. Giants after the flood, mighty ones in later lands, enemies remembered not only for their size but for their familiarity. As though humanity had seen them before. As though the past had returned wearing a new name. This raises a question too heavy to answer quickly. If the Nephilim survived, then someone allowed it. And if it was allowed, then judgment itself has layers we do not easily accept. Perhaps the flood was not meant to erase all consequences. Perhaps some things were preserved as witnesses, or warnings, or burdens the future would have to confront with open eyes. Tonight, we will not rush to accuse heaven of mercy or cruelty. We will walk slowly through what was remembered, what was feared, and what was never fully explained. Because before we can ask why they were allowed, we must first remember who they were. And so, the story begins where memory first refuses to be silent. Before the flood, the world did not feel abandoned. It felt occupied, not empty wilderness but shaped land stretched beneath a wide and patient sky. Valleys were terraced by careful hands. Rivers were redirected with stone and wood. Paths were worn smooth by generations who believed tomorrow would arrive as reliably as the sun. Humanity did not wait for judgment. It planned weddings. It marked seasons. It sang songs whose endings were already known. And above them, the sky watched. Ancient memory speaks of this age not as primitive, but as dense with presence. Something more than humans moved within the world. Not always seen. Not always feared. At first, I was welcomed. They were later called watchers. Some traditions say they were appointed guardians, set to observe the unfolding of human life without interference. Others describe them simply as beings of the heavens, older than cities, bearing knowledge shaped for realms not bound by soil and breath. However they are named, the memory agrees on one thing: a boundary existed, and it was crossed, not on fire, not in thunder, but slowly. Permission was not demanded, it was assumed. Observation turned into instruction. Distance softened into familiarity. The watchers did not fall all at once. They learned. And leaning, they taught. They showed humanity how to pull metal from the earth and shape it into tools that could also become weapons. They revealed patterns written in the stars before humanity knew how to look without losing itself. They unlocked processes that drew power from the world faster than the world could replenish it. Knowledge arrived before wisdom. From these unions between heaven's misstep and earth's hunger came the Nephilim. Not merely giants of stature, but of consequence. Their presence carried weight. They were tall, yes, but more troubling was how the world reacted to them. Paths shifted. Hierarchies bent. What had once been balanced grew uneven. They consumed more than food. They consumed orders. Where they settled, humanity reorganized itself around them. Leaders deferred. Labor intensified. Identity shrank. Dignity bent inward as protection was exchanged for obedience. At first, the exchange felt reasonable. Power promised safety. Strength promised peace. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The Nephilim were not described as mindless beasts. They built cities that cast long shadows. They organized societies that functioned with frightening efficiency. They inspired awe that bordered on worship and fear that was mistaken for reverence. Humanity followed them willingly, until following became dependence. The earth responded before heaven did. Fields that once yielded abundantly began to thin. Violence echoed where negotiation once stood. Blood entered the soil so deeply that later writers said the ground itself cried out, not in rage but in protest. Creation strained beneath lives it was never designed to support. This was not yet a judgment. It was an imbalance. The flood, still distant, would later be remembered not as fury, but as restraint. A boundary reasserted upon a world that had forgotten what limits were for. But before rain ever touched the ground, the damage was already complete. A forbidden boundary had been crossed so gradually that no one noticed, until it could no longer be uncrossed. And as the sky remained clear, one unspoken question settled quietly into the dust. If corruption had spread this far, could water alone ever reach its roots? The rain had not yet fallen, but the world was already breaking. Stillness lingered over the land even as imbalance deepened. Not the stillness of peace, but the heavy quiet that settles before something irreversible begins. Winds moved more slowly. Rivers carried more silt than water. The sky remained vast and blue, yet it no longer felt distant. It pressed closer as though listening. Humanity adapted as it always does. Life under the Nephilim reshaped what it meant to be human. Communities organized themselves around scale. Worth was measured by usefulness. Strength determined safety. Those closest to power ate well and slept beneath stone roofs. Those farther away learned to bow to labor, to disappear quietly. Some ancient memories suggest the giants were not uniformly cruel. They ruled because they could. They protected what belonged to them. They rewarded loyalty. In a world increasingly unstable, such order felt like mercy. Yet mercy that depends on dominance carries a cost. The Nephilim required constant supply. Their hunger was not gluttony alone, but consequence. Bodies built beyond natural proportion demanded more of everything. Grain, livestock relying on exhausted fields, labor drawn from shrinking communities. What they consumed, the land could not easily replace. So extraction accelerated. Forests fell faster than they regrew. Hills were cut open for metals that gleamed briefly before becoming blades. Rivers were redirected until wetlands dried and soil hardened. Humanity learned to take without waiting. The Watcher's knowledge made this possible. The giant's presence made it necessary, but this was only the beginning. As resources thinned, violence followed, not always openly. Sometimes it came as quiet removal. Sometimes law is enforced with overwhelming force. Blood stained the ground not only through battle but through routine. Lives became expendable. Memory records this not as chaos but as normalization. And the earth noticed. Later writings describe the ground itself reacting, crops failing without explanation. Animals migrating away from long-settled areas, tremors rippling through regions once stable. Whether literal or symbolic, the message remains. Creation was responding to pressure. The phrase "the earth cried out" appears again and again, not as poetry but as accusation. The world was being asked to bear what it was never designed to carry. Above it all, heaven watched. Ancient traditions are careful here. They do not depict immediate wrath. Instead, they suggest deliberation, a weighing of responsibility. The Watchers had acted. Humanity had participated. The giants had emerged. The system itself had tilted. Judgment in this framing was not sudden anger. It was recognition. Recognition that boundaries exist for preservation. Recognition that knowledge without restraint multiplies harm. Recognition that power once unleashed cannot easily be recalled. The flood, still distant, began to take shape not as punishment but as containment, a means of preventing total collapse. A pause forced upon a world accelerating toward exhaustion. Yet even as this resolution formed, another tension remained unresolved. If the Nephilim were consequences rather than anomalies, what did removal truly mean? Could erasing the visible outcome undo the choices that produced it? Some traditions hint that heaven itself faced limitation, not in power but in principle. Once life had been shaped, it carried weight. Undoing it entirely risked unraveling more than intended. Though the world remained suspended between patience and decision, cities continued to function, songs were still sung, children were still born beneath a sky that seemed unchanged. Yet beneath the rhythm of daily life, something irreversible had already begun. The ground waited, the sky watched, the balance tipped, and the question grew heavier with each passing season. Was judgment approaching to end corruption or to preserve what little harmony remained? The rain was not yet visible, but the silence was deepening. As the world moved closer to its breaking point, there were no alarms, no universal sign that announced the end, only small fractures easy to dismiss, hard to reverse. The sky remained open and calm. Sunlight still warmed the stone and field, yet some ancient memories describe the light itself as thinner, as though it passed through the world without fully settling. Nights grew heavier. Stars felt distant, their patterns harder to read, even for those taught by heavenly watchers. Humanity continued to live. That is what makes this age so haunting. People married beneath flowering trees. Elders told stories of earlier seasons when harvests were fuller and rivers clearer. Children learned trades shaped by knowledge that had once been forbidden but now felt indispensable. Life did not feel cursed. It felt accelerated, and acceleration is rarely noticed until impact. The Nephilim stood at the center of this world like living monuments to imbalance. Their strength held societies together even as it strained them apart. They ruled not always through cruelty but through inevitability. Resistance felt futile. Adaptation felt wise. Some traditions suggest that even the giants sensed something wrong, that their lives, though powerful, were heavy, that their hunger was never fully satisfied. That rest did not come easily to beings built beyond natural proportion. If they were feared by humans, they were also burdened by their own existence. They were not born to fit. They were born because a boundary failed. This is where ancient memory grows quiet. It does not linger on conversations between heaven and earth. It does not dramatize decrees. Instead, it speaks of resolve forming slowly like pressure beneath deep water. Judgment was coming, but not as rage. It would arrive as restraint, a reassertion of limits, a rebalancing of a world stretched too far. The flood, when it would come, would not single out every wrong. It would not parse intent or measure guilt with precision. It would act broadly because the system itself had become unstable. When foundations crack, repair cannot be delicate. Yet even here, mercy and consequence remained intertwined. Some ancient thinkers believed the flood was designed to stop the spread, not erase every trace. That corruption had entered creation so deeply that complete removal would require undoing life itself. Restraint, then, became the only path forward. If this is true, then the survival of certain outcomes was already implicit, not because they were desired, but because history once shaped carries weight that cannot be ignored. The rain would fall later, but long before the first drop touched soil, the decision had already been made. Creation itself seemed to prepare. Winds shifted direction. Waters gathered patience. The deep, long held at bay, waited beneath the surface. The sky did not darken in anger, it gathered in silence. The world before the flood was not ignorant of danger, it simply did not believe the end would come the way it did. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of this age. That collapse rarely feels dramatic from the inside, that boundaries erode through familiarity, that power, once normalized, hides its cost. The Nephilim did not arrive as monsters. The Watchers did not fall in a single moment. Humanity did not choose destruction outright. Everything happened gradually, reasonably, step by step, until restraint became the only remaining option. As the final calm stretched across the land, rivers continued to flow toward seas that would soon rise beyond their banks. The stone held warmth from the sun. Birds crossed the sky without urgency. Nothing looked like an ending. And yet, beneath the surface of this quiet world, something irreversible was already set in motion, something that would soon test whether judgment could truly cleanse what memory had already shaped. The sky remained open. The ground remained dry, But the question had shifted silently toward what would remain when the waters finally withdrew. When the flood came, it did not arrive as chaos, it arrived as command. The waters rose not like a storm, but like a sentence being carried out with terrible patience. That patience mattered. It suggested intention, not impulse. The ancient memory does not describe the flood as fury spilling over, but as a measured reversal. Dry land withdrew. Rivers forgot their banks. Boundaries dissolved as the deep reclaimed what had been borrowed. Creation inhaled what it had once exhaled. This was not annihilation, it was containment. Judgment in ancient thought rarely functions as total erasure. It isolates, it limits, it restrains what can no longer be allowed to spread. The flood did not argue with corruption, it covered it. Within this covering, the ark becomes more than rescue, it becomes a contrast. Inside it, preservation through obedience. Rhythms kept, breath measured. Life narrowed into trust. Outside it, dissolution without distinction. Power sank alongside poverty. Strength dissolved beside weakness. The waters did not choose, they equalized. But this equalization carried tension, because ancient memory refuses to end the story here. Later echoes speak quietly of endurance. Not salvation, not covenant, but residue. Giants appear again long after the waters retreat. Mighty ones rise in lands newly dried, their origins already suspect. These references are not loud, they do not insist. They linger like fog in valleys where certainty refuses to settle. And they introduce an unsettling possibility that judgment addressed scale, not essence. That the world was stabilized but not sterilized. That memory of rebellion was allowed to persist within limits. Why would judgment permit this? Some ancient thinkers proposed diminishment, that the Nephilim were reduced, weakened, restrained into forms the world could now bear. Others suggested remnants, bloodlines diluted, scattered, but not erased. Still others framed survival as consequence, not decision. Mercy extended too broadly to revoke, restraint chosen over undoing. Here the flood becomes veil, thick enough to restrain chaos, thin enough to let memory pass. The waters hid what could not yet be resolved. They quieted the world, but they did not silence it. When the rain ceased, the land breathed again. Mud cracked. Shoots rose. Birds returned to branches that had forgotten their weight. The reset was real. The erasure was not. Silence followed, but it was altered. Something had passed through the judgment, carried forward into the future. Not dominant, not free, but present. Judgment had drawn a line, it has stabilized a collapsing world. Yet beneath the calm, the question remained. What happens when what is restrained is not removed? The waters had receded. The land endured. And somewhere beyond the visible, memory waited. That waiting would shape what followed. This restraint shaped how ancient listeners understood justice. It was not imagined as a cleansing flame, but as a boundary placed back into a system that had lost all edges. Judgment restored limits, not innocence. The world emerged quieter but wiser, scarred but standing. Some later voices compared the flood to pruning rather than burning, excess removed, structure preserved, roots left intact, growth slowed so that fruit might someday return. In this view, survival of consequence was instructional. Memory would guard against repetition. Yet instruction requires tension. What remains must be faced. What lingers must be navigated. The post-flood world was therefore not simple. It was watchful. Boundaries were now visible, but they still required choosing. Humanity stepped forward carrying both relief and responsibility. The waters had done what they could. The rest would unfold slowly, through generations learning to live with what history had already shaped. And so the calm after judgment was not an ending but a pause, a held breath, a space where the future would be tested. In that pause, the seeds of later questions quietly settled. Questions about endurance, about allowance, about what judgment chooses to leave behind. They did not yet demand answers. They waited as the earth dried and the sky cleared. The silence was calm, but it was not empty. Something within it listened. Something within it remembered. And from that memory, future encounters would eventually rise. Those encounters would reveal that restraint carries meaning, and what survives judgment often shapes history more deeply than erased things alone. Stillness followed the flood, but it was not the stillness of forgetting. It was the stillness of a world relearning its shape. Water lingered in low places long after the rain ceased. Valleys became marshes. Coastlines shifted inward, then slowly receded. Mountains stood exposed, scraped clean, their ancient contours altered by force that had touched everything equally. The earth had survived, but it no longer felt familiar to those who walked upon it. Judgment had reset the surface. It had not erased depth. Ancient memory is careful to describe what followed. Humanity did not step into a pristine beginning, but into a quieter continuation. The violence that once echoed everywhere was restrained, yet the capacity for it remained. Knowledge was not forgotten. It was carried, now shadowed by consequence. This is where the meaning of the ark deepens. It floated not as an escape from history, but as witness to it. Within its walls, life endured through obedience rather than domination. No creature inside was chosen for strength or scale. All survived by containment, by limitation, by surrender to guidance beyond themselves. Outside the ark, everything else was leveled. This contrast mattered. It taught that survival was not random, yet neither was it exhaustive. The flood drew boundaries, not conclusions. It demonstrated what alignment preserved without pretending alignment erased everything misaligned had ever produced. Some traditions suggest that when the waters withdrew, they revealed a world reduced to essentials. Fewer people, fewer structures, less noise. Humanity was given space to choose differently. Consequences had mass. The idea that remnants of the Nephilim endured begins to surface here, not loudly but persistently. Later texts speak of giants appearing generations afterward, in lands far from the ark's resting place. Their presence is never celebrated. It is recorded with unease as something known but unresolved. This fuels the unsettling thought that judgment worked on scale rather than essence. The overwhelming density of corruption was reduced. The imbalance was made manageable. But the roots, entangled with human history, were not entirely pulled free. Why would such roots remain? Some ancient voices argue that complete erasure would have meant unmaking too much. Humanity itself had been shaped within the corrupted system. To erase every consequence would require erasing memory, lineage, and learning itself. Judgment chose preservation over perfection. Others suggest that restraint was pedagogical. What survives within limits can be observed, confronted, and understood. What is erased teaches only absence. Here, the flood as veil becomes clearer, thick enough to drown chaos, thin enough to allow truth through. The waters hid the worst of imbalance, but they did not pretend imbalance had never existed. This reframing alters how justice is understood. It is no longer imagined as an absolute wipe, but as a recalibration. A system brought back within tolerable bounds where choice could again function. The silence after the flood was therefore not neutral. It was charged. The world held its breath, as though aware that restraint had been chosen once and might be tested again. Humanity sensed this, even if it could not articulate it. Settlements were smaller. Structures are simpler. Caution entered custom. Stories of the old world were told with warning rather than pride. And yet, memory persisted. The mention of giants after the flood operates like a ripple through this calm, a reminder that what has weight does not disappear easily. That even judgment leaves behind shadows shaped like lessons. The waters had done their work. The land breathed again. But the silence that followed was not empty, it was attentive, as though history itself were listening to see what would be done with the restraint that had been given. What remained was not chaos but tension, not corruption unchecked but consequence constrained. And within that tension, a deeper question began to form, one that would not be answered immediately but would surface slowly, wherever humanity encountered what seemed too large, too familiar, too reminiscent of a world that was supposed to be gone. That question did not accuse judgment of failure. It wondered whether allowance itself carried purpose. and purpose, once suspected, demands attention. As the land continued to dry, life returned cautiously, as though testing whether the world was truly stable again. Shoots pushed through softened soil. Animals learned new paths across altered terrain. Humanity rebuilt not with confidence but with memory pressing close behind every decision. The flood had passed, but it had not passed through everything. Ancient traditions suggest that judgment, once enacted, does not linger to explain itself. It leaves space for interpretation, space for choice. Space for humanity to discover what restraint actually means when catastrophe is no longer immediate. This is where the idea of endurance becomes most unsettling. The reappearance of giants in later generations is not framed as defiance of judgment, but as evidence of its limits. They do not return as rulers of a global world. They appear regionally, isolated, bound to specific lands and lineages, powerful, yes, but contained. This containment matters. If the flood had erased every trace of prejudgment corruption, then humanity's future obedience would rest on ignorance rather than wisdom. But ancient memory suggests the opposite, that the world was allowed to remember so it could choose differently. The Nephilim, or what remained of their kind, became living markers of history's weight. Their presence reminded humanity that boundaries are not abstract rules. They are safeguards against consequences that, once released, cannot be fully undone. Some later thinkers described judgment as triage rather than cure. The flood stabilized what was dying. It did not promise perfection. In this framework, restraint becomes the highest form of mercy. The alternative, total erasure, would require destroying more than it saves. The veil of the flood hid much, but it did not lie. What emerged was a quieter world, but not a naive one. Humanity now lived with the knowledge that heaven would intervene when limits collapsed, but also that intervention would not remove every scar. Responsibility, once learned, could not be surrendered again. The arc fades from the story at this point, but its lesson remains. Life preserved through obedience thrives within limits. Life built on excess fractures itself. This contrast continues to echo long after the waters are gone. Silence settles over the land, but it is not empty silence. It is filled with memory, with caution, with awareness that judgment has shape and intention, but also boundaries of its own. And so the question of endurance becomes unavoidable. If some things remained after judgment, then their survival was not accidental. It was allowed within restraint, not as endorsement, but as consequence permitted to exist long enough to be understood. The flood did not erase rebellion from history. It prevented rebellion from ruling the future unchecked. The land breathed. The sky cleared. Humanity stepped forward into a world that could once again support life, but only if life respected limits. Somewhere beyond the horizon, stories were already forming, of encounters with beings too large to ignore, of fear resurfacing in places thought cleansed, of memory returning where silence had reigned. These stories would not accuse the flood of failure. They would reveal its purpose, because what judgment allows to remain often becomes the very measure by which future faith is tested. The world had been reset, but not emptied, and as generations spread across the land, carrying both relief and unease, the stage was quietly being set for encounters that would force humanity to ask not whether judgment had worked, but why what survived had been permitted to stand at all. The waters were gone. The restraint held. But in distant lands and later days, echoes of great stature would rise again, challenging memory, stirring fear, and drawing the next chapter of this ancient question closer into view. When humanity stepped back onto dry ground, the world felt cleansed, but unfamiliar. The air carried a sharper edge. The silence felt wider than before. Mountains stood where they had not stood in that shape, their slopes scarred and reshaped by waters that had stripped them bare. Rivers no longer followed remembered paths. They carved new channels through stone as if uncertain where they belonged. The past was no longer visible, yet it had not vanished. Life resumed slowly. Tents gave way to villages. Villages grew into cities. Generations passed who had never seen the rain fall as judgment, only as blessing. Stories of the flood became memory, then tradition, then warning repeated around fires whose warmth felt permanent again. Nations formed. Borders were drawn. Humanity believed the world had been made simple. And then unexpectedly the old fear returned. The texts do not introduce it dramatically. They do not pause to explain. They simply record encounters, brief, heavy moments where ordinary human movement collided with something that should not have been there anymore. Giants, not spoken of as myth, not framed as imagination, but as obstacles, as presences rooted in particular lands. Bashan, Canaan. Highland regions where stone rose sharply from earth, as though memory itself clung more tightly there. What unsettled ancient readers was not merely their size, it was recognition. These beings felt familiar even to those generations removed from the flood. Their presence stirred something older than fear and echo, as though the world itself remembered them, as though history long submerged had pressed upward again through the surface. Their names differed: Rephaim, Anakim, Zamzumim, each name tied to a place. Each associated with overwhelming presence. Each described with careful restraint, yet unmistakable weight. The pattern remained even when the details changed. A recurring shadow, different names, same weight. Human fear magnified in their presence, not only because of physical scale, but because of what they represented. If giants walked the land again, then the flood had not erased everything it was meant to end. Judgment had not guaranteed simplicity. This realization altered how ancient communities understood faith. Obedience did not equal safety. Covenant did not mean absence of threat. Trust did not remove fear, it redefined how fear was faced. The texts refuse to explain how these giants appeared. They circle the question instead. Some traditions imply survival through lineage, bloodlines diluted but persistent. Others suggest renewed corruption, boundaries crossed again in quieter ways. Still others fall silent as though explanation itself were dangerous. What matters is not how they appeared, it is what they did. Their existence forced humanity to confront a deeper truth, that judgment does not eliminate struggle, it changes its shape. The world after the flood still required courage, perhaps more than before, because fear now came with memory. The giants did not dominate the world. They occupied margins. They resisted settlement. They slowed expansion. They became thresholds humanity had to cross not only with weapons but with conviction. Perhaps this was the point. Perhaps judgment was never meant to remove every terror but to strip terror of its authority, to teach humanity that survival after correction still demanded choice. The giants stood as reminders that consequence lingers, that history leaves residue, that even restrained, what once disrupted creation does not vanish quietly. The land remained dry. The sky remained clear. But beneath the calm of a world rebuilt, echoes moved, old shapes wearing new names, pressing the same ancient question into the present. If judgment had passed, why did fear still walk the earth? And more quietly still, what was humanity meant to learn each time that shadow returned? Fear after the flood did not arrive as panic. It arrived as recognition. Ancient communities encountering the giants did not react as though meeting something entirely new. The texts suggest hesitation before terror, as if memory stirred first. The sight of immense stature awakened something buried, stories heard too early in childhood, warnings passed down without explanation, names spoken softly and then avoided. The world had moved on, but my memory did not. These giants did not roam everywhere. They were localized, fixed to certain regions as if bound by invisible lines. Bashan became synonymous with their presence. Canaan carried their reputation. The highlands where stone rose close to the sky seemed to remember them best. This detail mattered to ancient listeners. If corruption had simply returned, it would have spread again. But instead it lingered, contained, restricted. The giants were not everywhere, they were somewhere, and that somewhere carried weight. Their recurrence forced a theological tension the texts never fully resolved. If the flood had been complete judgment, why did echoes remain? And if echoes remained, what did that say about the nature of justice itself? The traditions refused to simplify the answer. Some imply lineage, that remnants of pre-flood bloodlines endured, diluted through generations, weakened but recognizable. Others hint at renewed boundary crossing, quieter, less global but still consequential. Still others simply record the encounters and move on, as though explanation would risk misinterpretation. This silence is deliberate. Ancient writers understood that certainty can become a trap. To explain too clearly is to claim mastery over mystery. Instead, they allow ambiguity to remain, forcing each generation to wrestle with what fear reveals about faith. The giant's presence tested more than military strength. It tested memory. It tested whether humanity would respond as before, seeking power to counter power, or whether something had shifted since the flood. This is why the giants are consistently framed as obstacles rather than rulers. They do not dominate nations. They do not reshape the world. They resist progress, slow settlement, intimidate communities, but they do not inherit the earth. Their power is real yet limited. This limitation is crucial. It suggests that what survived the flood did so under constraint. The giants could still instill fear, but they could no longer define reality. They were shadows of an earlier age, not its continuation. A recurring shadow, different names, same weight. Human reactions varied. Some communities recoiled, interpreting the giants as proof that judgment had failed. Others pressed forward cautiously, believing that survival itself demanded confrontation. In these responses, faith took on texture. It became practical. It learned to move with fear rather than pretend fear was gone. The texts preserve these moments not to glorify conquest, but to document transformation. Humanity after the flood was not promised an easy world. It was promised a bounded one, and bounds change everything. Fear no longer signaled inevitable collapse. It became a decision point. Would humanity retreat into old patterns of dependence and dominance, or would it trust that restraint, divine and human, had altered the rules? This is why the giants matter more as symbols than as enemies. They embody the truth that judgment resets conditions, not complexity. The world remains demanding. But it is no longer uncontrollable. The giant's existence taught that faith does not erase fear, it reframes it. Courage after judgment is quieter. It is not reckless. It remembers what happens when boundaries fail. As generations passed, the giants did not multiply. Their presence thinned. Their influence narrowed. Their names lingered longer than their power. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Each encounter reinforced a lesson. The flood had changed the world, but it had not absolved humanity from responsibility. Survival after judgment required discernment. Memory has become part of obedience. And so the echoes continued, not loudly but persistently, until humanity learned to walk forward without pretending the past had never existed. Fear still returned, but it is no longer ruled by default. It waited, asking the same question each time it appeared. Would humanity face it as before or as something new? Over time, the giants became less a shock and more a measure. They no longer represented the end of the world, but the endurance of consequence. Each appearance reminded humanity that history does not disappear when water recedes. It settles. It embeds itself into land, into lineage, into memory that resurfaces when conditions allow. The texts reflect this shift subtly. Fear remains, but it matures. Communities learn to assess rather than panic. The giants are still formidable, still unsettling, but they are no longer interpreted as proof that judgment failed. Instead, they are understood as evidence that judgment was never meant to simplify existence. This reframing matters. If the flood had promised a world without threat, then every giant would signal divine absence. But if the flood promised restraint, limits placed upon chaos, then the presence of giants within boundaries becomes intelligible. They contain reminders, not unchecked disasters. A recurring shadow, different names, same weight. What gives the giants their power is not only size, but memory. They awaken stories humanity would rather forget. Stories of a time when power ruled without restraint, when protection was bought at the cost of dignity, when boundaries blurred because strength made resistance feel pointless. In this way, the giants function as mirrors. They reveal how fear tempts humanity toward old solutions, toward domination, compromise, or surrender. Each encounter becomes a test, not of muscle but of orientation. Will humanity respond by imitating what once corrupted the world, or by trusting that restraint has changed what is possible? Ancient communities did not always choose well. Some retreated, some negotiated, some fought prematurely. The texts preserve these responses without moralizing too quickly. They allow complexity. Fear does not make villains. Courage does not guarantee wisdom. Yet across generations a pattern emerges. The giants diminish, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. Their territories shrink. Their names fragment. Their influence fades into reputation rather than reality. What once dominated conversation becomes something spoken of in the past tense. This gradual disappearance is crucial. It suggests that what survives judgment is not meant to last indefinitely. It is meant to teach until it no longer needs to remain. Survival, whether human or otherwise, carries consequence, but consequence is not eternal. The giants were not destroyed immediately because destruction was not the lesson. Endurance under restraint was. Their fatting marks a shift in the world's balance. The earth, once strained beneath their weight, begins to hold again. Communities settle lands once feared. Memory loosens its grip. Still, the texts never allow full forgetfulness. The names remain recorded, the places remembered, because erasure would tempt repetition. Memory guards the future by refusing to vanish completely. As the echoes of the giants recede, another truth becomes clear. Judgment has not failed to remove them quickly. It had succeeded in redefining how humanity lived with what remained. The world after the flood required courage, yes, but not the courage of domination. It required the courage to trust limits, to believe that power constrained by law is stronger than power unleashed without boundary. The giants stood as reminders of what happens when that belief collapses, and when they finally fade from the land, their absence feels earned, not abrupt. The world has learned enough to bear their memory without needing their presence. Silence returns, but it is a different silence than before. Not empty, not fragile, a silence shaped by experience. Wind moves through highlands once feared. Rivers run through valleys once avoided. Stone remembers, but it no longer resists. Yet even as this chapter of fear closes, the question that underlies it does not disappear. It simply moves deeper. If judgment allows such echoes to remain for a time, then allowance itself carries meaning. And meaning invites inquiry. The giants are gone, or nearly so. But the reason they were ever permitted to remain now presses closer, waiting to be examined. Survival implies allowance. This is the quiet truth that unsettles the story more than any description of giants or floods. If remnants of the Nephilim endured, then the question shifts. Not how they survived, but why they were not fully erased. Ancient theology does not dwell on divine inability. Power is assumed. What remains, then, is choice. And choice introduces tension. Permission in ancient thought does not always mean approval. Often it means exposure. What is allowed to remain stays visible. What stays visible can be measured, confronted, and remembered. What is hidden, by contrast, multiplies in silence. This distinction matters. The surviving giants do not reappear at the center of civilization. They are not crowned kings of the new world. Instead, they occupy margins, borderlands, high places where stone rises sharply and settlement hesitates. Regions resistant to cultivation, as though the land itself remembers strain. They are present, but constrained, powerful, but bounded. Their existence feels tolerated rather than endorsed, watched rather than celebrated. Ancient memory never frames them as a blessing. It records them as a burden allowed to persist under restraint. Some interpreters saw this as an intentional warning, living evidence of what happens when boundaries collapse. proof etched into flesh and scale that rebellion leaves marks time alone cannot heal. The giants become consequences with legs, visible reminders that some choices shape generations. Others sensed a deeper tension at work, that heaven itself was reckoning with law, that total erasure, while possible, would violate structures even judgment must respect. Once consequence is released into history, it carries weight. It can be restrained. It can be diminished. But it cannot simply be undone without unraveling more than intended. This idea reframes judgment itself, not as absolute silence but as calibrated restraint. A divine pause placed just short of total erasure, a line drawn not at memory but at domination. In this view, the giants become relics of a prior age, not meant to rule again, not allowed to expand, but not erased from the record of creation either. Their presence forces humanity to choose obedience repeatedly, not once, not abstractly, but in proximity to fear. Faith, then, is no longer theoretical. It must be practiced near what threatens it. The giant's survival ensures this tension remains active. Humanity cannot claim obedience simply because the world feels safe. Obedience must be chosen even when fear stands visible on the horizon, even when the past appears to have found a way back. Permission does not mean safety. It means responsibility. Responsibility to remember why boundaries exist. Responsibility to refuse old solutions. Responsibility to trust that restraint, divine and human, has altered what power can do. And so the giants remain for a time, heavy, limited, watched, not as rulers of the world, but as reminders of what the world could become again. They stand like monuments placed at the edges of history, not inviting return but refusing erasure. Their existence presses a question into every generation that encounters them. Will you respond as before or as one who has learned? The answer is never assumed. It must be lived. And in this unresolved space, between allowance and approval, between memory and restraint, the meaning of permission begins to take shape, not as indulgence, but as a test. A test that does not shout but waits, silent and immovable, until humanity decides how it will walk past what judgment chose not to silence completely. Allowance, once recognized, reshapes how the story is heard. If the giants remained by permission rather than accident, then their presence was not meaningless. Ancient memory leans into this discomfort. It does not rush to defend heaven's decision, nor does it accuse it. Instead, it invites reflection on what allowance reveals about the nature of judgment itself. In many traditions, exposure is a form of restraint. What is allowed to exist openly cannot grow unchecked. It must remain visible, accountable, limited by the gaze of law and memory. Hidden corruption spreads quietly. Exposed consequences still stand long enough to be understood. This may explain why the giants are consistently described as confined. They do not roam freely across the earth. They inhabit margins, borderlands between settled and unsettled space. Highlands are difficult to cultivate, regions where life requires effort and vigilance. Their geography becomes symbolic. They dwell where humanity must choose whether to advance or retreat, where fear and faith meet without distraction, where obedience cannot be assumed because safety is not guaranteed. The giants are powerful, but their power is strangely static. They do not innovate. They do not adapt well to a world reshaped by covenant and law. They resist rather than expand. They endure, but they do not flourish. This too feels intentional. Some ancient thinkers describe them as weights placed at the edges of history, not to pull the world backward, but to prevent it from forgetting what backward looks like. They embody excess without restraint, frozen in a form that can no longer evolve. In this way, their survival becomes instructional rather than threatening. Others saw in their allowance a reflection of divine patience. Judgment had acted decisively, but it had not rushed to erase every outcome. The cosmos itself, in this view, was being taught. Boundaries mattered, consequences mattered, but so did continuity. Total erasure would suggest that rebellion could be undone without residue, that history could be rewritten cleanly. Ancient memory resists this idea. It treats time as cumulative. What happens leaves marks. Judgment, then, does not deny reality. It manages it. This management is visible in how the giants are framed. They are not portrayed as victorious survivors. They are weary figures, burdensome even to themselves. Their presence feels heavy, not triumphant. They are reminders of imbalance, not celebrations of strength. A divine restraint, judgment stopping just short of absolute silence. This restraint places responsibility squarely on humanity. If fear remains, how will it be faced? If echoes persist, how will memory be handled? Will humanity seek again to harness power without limit, or will it trust that restraint has redefined what victory looks like? The giants make neutrality impossible. One cannot ignore them. One must choose a response. This is where faith becomes embodied. No longer a concept spoken in safety, but a posture practiced near threat. Obedience must now function where fear is present, not absent. Trust must operate without guarantees of ease. The allowance of the giants ensures this condition persists long enough to teach. Over time, humanity learns, not perfectly, not quickly, but gradually. Encounters become less catastrophic. Fear is still felt, but it no longer dictates every decision. Memory begins to guide rather than paralyze. The giants remain, but their influence wanes. They stand as tests that do not repeat forever, as questions that eventually receive answers through live response rather than explanation. Allowance in this light is not indulgence. It is an apprenticeship, a world learning how to live with power restrained rather than unleashed, a humanity learning that obedience is not proven by the absence of threat, but by the presence of restraint. And still, the deepest question remains just beneath the surface. If allowance teaches, then what exactly was meant to be learned? The story has not yet been told. It waits, like the giants themselves, at the edge of understanding, asking not for speculation but for patience. Permission, once it is fully felt, changes how responsibility is carried. The giants did not remain forever. But while they did, they stood as silent participants in a larger lesson unfolding across generations. Their presence was not dynamic. It did not escalate. It endured, heavy, watchful, restrained. This endurance matters. In ancient imagination, what is truly dangerous is not what endures under limits, but what spreads without them. The giants did not spread. They did not multiply beyond control. They did not reclaim the world that once bent beneath their weight. They remained where restraint placed them, and restraint held. This suggests that judgment had accomplished its primary purpose. Chaos no longer ruled the system. The world, though imperfect, functioned again. Rivers flowed within banks. Seasons returned. Humanity could plan without constant collapse, yet planning now included memory. The giants' survival ensured that memory could not be romanticized. The past was not spoken of as a golden age. It was remembered as a warning. The giants embodied what happens when power escapes boundary, when permission is mistaken for entitlement. In this way, they became instructors without words. Their very form taught what imbalance looks like. Their isolation taught what happens when excess cannot integrate into a bounded world. Their gradual fatting taught that what cannot adapt to restraint eventually loses relevance. Judgment had not failed to destroy them quickly. It had succeeded in neutralizing what made them dangerous. They were no longer architects of the world. They were artifacts within it. This distinction reshapes the meaning of permission. Allowance does not mean endorsement. It means space given for learning to complete its work. It means the world is trusted to grow wiser rather than remain protected by erasure. Faith matures here, no longer dependent on dramatic rescue, no longer shocked by the presence of threat. Faith learns to operate within complexity, to trust that limits are real even when fear still appears. The giants lingered just long enough to teach this, and when they began to disappear quietly without ceremony, their absence felt earned. Humanity has changed. The world had changed. What once required visible warning no longer needed constant reminder. Still, ancient memory refuses to close the account too neatly, because permission once recognized raises further questions. If giants were allowed to remain for a time, then allowance itself must serve a purpose beyond that moment. It suggests a pattern in how judgment operates across history: restraint over erasure, exposure over concealment, learning over forgetting. These patterns will appear again. The story does not rush forward. It pauses here, letting the weight of permission settle, letting the listener feel the difference between a world emptied of threat and a world taught how to face it. Wind moves across high places once feared. Stone remains where giants once stood. The land is quieter now, not because memory is gone, but because it has been integrated. Yet something lingers beneath this calm. If permission was given once, under restraint, then future encounters with fear will not be accidents. They will be moments of testing, shaped by the same principles that govern this allowance. Judgment has shown its method. Now humanity must live with its implications. The giants recede into history, but the question they embody does not fade with them. It simply changes form, waiting to surface again wherever humanity encounters power that feels too large, too familiar, too tempting to handle without restraint. And in that waiting, the next tension quietly approaches, one that shifts attention away from the giants themselves and toward those who once crossed the boundary that made them possible in the first place. When humanity encountered the giants after the flood, fear arrived without negotiation. The texts describe it vividly, but not dramatically. Hearts melting, courage thinning, words failed before they could be spoken, entire communities pausing at the edge of movement as though breath itself required permission to continue. The giants did not need to act. Their scale was enough. They violated proportion. To stand before them was to feel misplaced in one's own body. Human limbs felt insufficient. Human voices sounded small. The ground itself seemed to favor the heavier step. Fear in these moments was not imagination. It was a measurement. Ancient writers do not dismiss this fear. They do not mock it or rush past it. Instead, they linger because fear reveals something essential. What terrifies us exposes what we believe about ourselves. Before the giants, humanity felt small, not merely in height but in meaning. The Nephilim embodied an alternative vision of power: strength without restraint, presence without humility, authority enforced by sheer scale. Against such power, obedience felt fragile. Covenant felt thin. Trust felt abstract. Fear magnified this doubt. Standing before giants, humanity confronted a mirror that reflected its own insecurity. If power truly belonged to the largest, then survival would always belong to those willing to dominate. If size determined worth, then alignment meant nothing. Yet the texts introduce tension here. Fear is immediate, but it is not always final. In several narratives, the giants fall. Not because humans become stronger, but because something else intervenes. Trust outweighs terror. Obedience interrupts intimidation. The moment of fear becomes a threshold rather than an ending. This contrast is deliberate. The giants are tall but internally fractured. Their strength does not grant peace. Their presence does not create harmony. They carry weight without rest, power without direction. Humanity, by comparison, appears fragile, but it carries a covenant. Here, the measuring line shifts. Not of height, but of allegiance. Ancient memory insists that fear is not a verdict. It is a test. It asks whether humanity will define itself by what overwhelms it or by what it aligns with. The giants force this question repeatedly. Each encounter becomes an examination of identity. Is power defined by scale or by orientation? By size or by obedience? At first, fear dominates. Communities retreat. Voices tremble, movement slows, but over time something changes. Fear becomes navigable. Not absent, but manageable. This transformation does not happen through eradication. It happens through repetition, through memory, through choosing trust again in the presence of threat. Perhaps this was part of the allowance, not to glorify giants, but to teach humanity that terror does not have to rule decisions. That fear can be felt without being obeyed. The giants expose human insecurity, but they also reveal human capacity. And in that revelation, the meaning of survival begins to sharpen. quietly, patiently, preparing the ground for what fear alone could never teach. Fear, once encountered repeatedly, begins to change its tone. At first it was overwhelming. It freezes movement and collapses imagination. But when fear is faced again and again and does not end the story, it slowly loses its authority. Ancient texts trace this transition carefully, not as triumph, but as maturation. Humanity did not grow taller. It grew steadier. The giants remained immense. Their stature did not diminish overnight. What changed was how humanity interpreted what it saw. Scale, once assumed to equal destiny, began to lose its certainty. Presence no longer meant permission. Weight is no longer a guaranteed rule. This shift was subtle but profound. Ancient writers describe moments where fear still surged, scouts returning shaken, voices trembling as reports were given, entire assemblies falling silent at the mention of giants' names. Yet these moments did not always end in retreat. Sometimes they ended up waiting, sometimes in counsel, sometimes in quiet resolve. Fear was still present, but it was no longer final. This is where the mirror of scale becomes clearest. Standing before giants forced humanity to ask what it truly measured itself by. Was identity anchored in physical capacity or in alignment with something unseen but enduring? The giants represented excess without balance. Their power was immediate but shallow. It relied on intimidation and memory of former dominance. They were strong but rigid, unable to adapt to a world now governed by law, covenant, and limit. Humanity, though smaller, proved flexible. Communities learned to move differently. They learned to trust timing rather than force. They learned to wait when fear demanded haste and to advance when fear demanded retreat. These choices reshaped what courage looked like. Courage was no longer loud, it was deliberate. The texts preserve this contrast without exaggeration. Victories are not framed as glory. Losses are not framed as shame. The focus remains on orientation. Who trusted scale? Who trusted alignment? Here again, the measuring line appears. Not of height, but of allegiance. Those who measured reality by size alone remained trapped by fear. Those who measured by alignment discovered that fear could be endured without surrendering identity. The giants, though physically imposing, were increasingly revealed as spiritually unstable, unable to operate within restraint, unable to coexist with a bounded world. Their internal fracture became visible over time. They resisted order. They clung to excess. They could not imagine power without domination. As the world adjusted to law and limit, they became anomalies, remnants of a system that no longer fit. This is why their decline is described not as defeat but as obsolescence. They did not fall because humanity surpassed them in strength. They fell because the world no longer supported what they represented. Fear, once dominant, became navigable. This navigation did not eliminate danger. It redefined the response. Humanity learned that terror does not always signal retreat. Sometimes it signals a boundary to be crossed carefully, with trust rather than force. Perhaps this, too, was part of the allowance, to give fear enough time to teach its limits, to reveal that power built on scale alone cannot endure in a world structured by restraint, to allow humanity to discover that its capacity was never meant to mirror the giants, but to outlast them. The giants continued to expose human insecurity, but with each encounter, they also uncovered something deeper. A capacity not to dominate fear, but to carry it without being undone. And as that capacity strengthened, the question grew sharper, quieter, and more personal. If fear no longer rules decisions, then what does? As fear became familiar, it lost its ability to define the future. This did not happen suddenly. Ancient memory never rushes transformation. It records hesitation, failure, return, and quiet persistence. Humanity did not conquer fear once and for all. It learned to live alongside it without surrendering direction. The giants remained large, but they no longer felt inevitable. What once paralyzed entire communities began to function as a reference point rather than a verdict. Fear still rose, but it no longer decided alone. Counsel followed fear. Memory followed panic. Alignment followed doubt. This is where the mirror of scale completes its work. The giants forced humanity to confront a false equation it had long accepted. That size equals authority, that force equals right, that survival belongs to those who dominate first. Each encounter tested whether this equation would be repeated or revised. Over time, it was revised. The texts describe moments where fear is acknowledged openly, not denied. Hearts still tremble, voices still waver, but obedience steps forward anyway, not recklessly, not blindly, but with deliberate trust. Courage does not erase fear, it carries it. The giants, by contrast, cannot carry restraint. They remain bound to an older logic, a logic of intimidation and excess, a world where power must prove itself constantly or be replaced. In a system now governed by law and limit, this logic becomes unstable. Their decline follows naturally, not through dramatic extermination, but through incompatibility. They cannot adapt to restraint. They cannot flourish without excess. They cannot integrate into a world that no longer bends to scale alone, and so slowly they lose relevance. Their strength remains impressive. Their authority does not. This is the quiet reversal ancient memory preserves. The giants do not lose because humanity grows stronger. They lose because humanity grows aligned. Covenant begins to outweigh intimidation. Trust begins to outlast terror. Here, the measuring line becomes unmistakable, not of height, but of allegiance. Those aligned with restraint endure. Those aligned with excess diminish. The giants become symbols of a power that cannot survive without breaking the world around it. Humanity becomes evidence that limitation, when chosen, does not weaken, it stabilizes. Fear, once dominant, now serves a different function. It becomes information rather than instruction. It alerts without commanding. It warns without ruling. This transformation marks a turning point not only in human history, but in the meaning of judgment itself. Perhaps this was always the purpose of allowance, not to glorify giants, not to terrorize humanity indefinitely, but to provide a living contrast long enough for discernment to mature. The giants exposed human insecurity, but they also revealed human capacity. Capacity to choose alignment over imitation. Capacity to trust restraint over scale. Capacity to remain small without being insignificant. And in this revelation, the purpose of survival becomes clearer. What endured after the flood was not meant to dominate again. It was meant to teach until it could no longer do so. Once the lesson took root, the presence faded. The giants recede from the narrative not with spectacle but with silence. Their names linger longer than their influence. Their places remain marked but no longer feared. The land absorbs their memory and continues. Wind passes over hills once avoided. Stone stands where great bodies once stood. Life moves forward not because fear vanished but because fear was understood. This understanding does not end the story, it deepens it. Because if fear can be faced without surrender, then the question shifts once more, away from giants, away from scale, toward something more subtle and more dangerous. If humanity has learned not to measure power by size, then what will it measure next? And what happens when the true source of corruption is no longer visible on the horizon, but hidden within desire, memory, and choice itself? The ground is quiet now, but the deeper reckoning is drawing closer. The continued presence of the giants reframes everything that came before them. They are not accidents left behind by incomplete judgment. They are outcomes, visible consequences of choices made when boundaries were crossed and restraint was dismissed. In ancient thought, consequence is not cruelty. It's continuity. What is set into motion does not simply vanish when regret arrives. What is unleashed cannot always be recalled. The watchers transgressed. They crossed a boundary that had shape and purpose. Humanity participated, curious, willing, unguarded. From that convergence, the giants emerged. Their existence was not random. It was the natural result of imbalance allowed to mature. The flood restrained the spread, but consequence remained embedded in history. This distinction matters deeply. Judgment acted decisively, yet it did not pretend the past had never happened. The world moved forward, but it carried scars, not to punish endlessly but to instruct persistently. Ancient memory understands scars differently than wounds. A wound seeks closure. A scar remains visible. It teaches the body where it has been, what it has endured, and what must not be repeated. A scar that teaches more than a wound that vanishes. The giants become these scars within the landscape of history. Their presence forces memory upon a people eager to forget. Each encounter disrupts the illusion of clean beginnings. Each shadow across the land insists that history does not reset without residue. They stand where rebellion once flourished. They inhabit lands heavy with past defiance. Their geography is not incidental. Bashan, Canaan, highlands shaped by ancient resistance, places where excess once took root deeply enough to leave an imprint. Their size is not merely physical, it is symbolic. Excess made visible, power without restraint embodied in flesh. In allowing them to persist, heaven does not endorse the past, it confronts the future with it. Humanity cannot move forward pretending the cost of corruption was imaginary. The giants ensure that memory remains embodied, not abstract. The lesson here is not that corruption wins. It is that choices echo. Every step taken without restraint sends ripples forward. Judgment can halt expansion. It can stabilize collapse. But responsibility remains. The future must live with what the past shaped. The giants, then, are not mercy extended toward themselves. They are instructions extended toward everyone else. Their endurance forces humanity to mature, to learn restraint not because catastrophe threatens again immediately, but because memory has taught what happens when restraint is lost. They do not last forever, but they last long enough. Long enough for humanity to stop asking why judgment did not erase everything, and begin asking what it means to live wisely with what cannot be undone. The ground beneath them is heavy with story, and every footstep near them carries a reminder. History does not accuse, it teaches. And as long as the giants remain, that lesson cannot be ignored. Consequence, once recognized, reshapes how judgment itself is understood. Ancient memory does not describe the giants as mistakes heaven failed to correct. It frames them as continuity made visible, a living reminder that the world does not return to innocence simply because restraint has been applied. Innocence, once lost, is not restored by force. It is replaced by wisdom or by repetition. This is why the giants endure for a time. They carry history in their bodies. Their presence is not random. They rise where rebellion once found agreement, where boundaries were ignored not once but repeatedly. The land remembers this. Soil absorbs it, stone reflects it. Even after water has passed over everything, some places remain heavier than others. The giants inhabit those places. They do not invent new corruption. They embody old consequences. They are unresolved history given form, large enough that no generation can pretend it does not exist. This is uncomfortable. Humanity longs for clean narratives, endings that close fully, judgments that erase rather than educate. But ancient theology resists this desire. It insists that responsibility cannot be removed without cost. If consequence vanished entirely, learning would vanish with it. Judgment, then, limits damage without dissolving meaning. The flood stopped the spread. It reasserted the boundary. It restored a world capable of sustaining life again. But it did not absolve humanity from carrying memory. The giants ensure this. They prevent the lie that the past no longer matters. Each encounter becomes a confrontation with inherited weight, not guilt but awareness, not accusation but continuity, a scar that teaches more than a wound that vanishes. Scars do not reopen endlessly. They remain quiet until pressure reminds the body they exist. The giants function this way within history. Most days they are distant, rare, peripheral, but when encountered they awaken caution that would otherwise fade. This is why they diminish slowly rather than disappear suddenly. Denial would erase them quickly. Violence would silence them dramatically, but law constrains them. Time wears them down. Restraint makes them obsolete. They fade because the world changes around them. Humanity learns to live within boundaries. Communities develop structures that value restraint over domination. Leadership shifts from raw strength toward order, memory, and alignment. In such a world, giants cannot thrive. They require excess. They require imbalance. As restraint becomes normal, their relevance weakens. The giants do not fall because they are hunted relentlessly. They fall because they no longer fit. Their size, once intimidating, becomes impractical. Their power, once central, becomes isolated. They are not erased. They are outgrown. This distinction preserves dignity without granting dominance. Ancient writers allow this process to unfold quietly. They do not celebrate the giant's decline. They record it as a natural consequence. What cannot adapt to restraint eventually loses its place. This reveals something crucial about the nature of judgment. Judgment does not rush to finish the lesson. It allows time for transformation. It trusts that restraint, once learned, will reshape reality more effectively than repeated destruction ever could. The giants endure long enough for humanity to internalize the cost of excess. Once that cost is understood, their presence is no longer required. And so their allowance is not mercy toward them. It is an instruction for everyone else. Instruction that power without boundary consumes itself. That scale without alignment fractures. That history ignored will return embodied heavier each time. The giants do not accuse humanity of past failure. They warn it against future repetition. In this way, consequence becomes a teacher rather than a sentence, a presence rather than a punishment. The world moves forward carrying scars, but scars that stabilize, not reopen. As generations pass, the giants thin from memory. Their names remain longer than their bodies. Their territories settle. Their stories become lessons rather than threats. Yet something subtle continues to work beneath this quiet. If consequence is allowed to endure for instruction, then humanity must learn to read it correctly, to discern what is consequence and what is temptation disguised as strength. This discernment does not end with giants. It prepares humanity for subtler trials, ones that will not announce themselves with size or terror, but with opportunity, influence, and desire. And as the giants fade into the background of history, another tension begins to rise, one that shifts attention away from visible excess and toward the quieter weight of internal choice. As a consequence, the giants did not disappear in the spectacle. They faded. This fading is one of the most revealing aspects of the narrative. Ancient memory does not record a final battle that ends them all. There is no single moment of closure. Instead, there is thinning, less mention, narrowing influence. Their names persist longer than their presence, until even the names become references rather than realities. This is how consequence resolves when restraint is effective. The giants diminish because the conditions that produced them no longer exist. Boundaries hold. Knowledge is tempered. Desire is constrained by law and memory. Excess finds no soil in which to grow. The world does not deny the giants, it outgrows them. This outgrowing is slow and uneven. Fear still surfaces. Memory still stirs. But the giants no longer shape the direction of history. They no longer define what power looks like. They become reminders rather than rulers. In this sense, their allowance has reached its purpose. A scar that teaches more than a wound that vanishes. The scar remains visible long after pain subsides. It no longer demands attention, but it informs movement. It reminds the body of its limits without reopening harm. The giants function this way within collective memory. Their story lingers, shaping caution, without requiring constant confrontation. Heaven, in allowing this process, does not endorse what came before. It allows consequence to mature into wisdom. It trusts time under restraint to finish what force alone cannot. This trust places responsibility squarely on humanity. Judgment has done its part. The flood restrained chaos. Law restructured the world. Consequence taught memory. Now humanity must carry forward what it has learned. The giants fade not because they are forgiven, but because they are no longer needed as teachers. Their lesson has been absorbed. Their presence has become redundant. This resolution preserves moral weight without cruelty. Corruption does not win, but it is not erased cheaply. Choices echo, but echoes weaken when wisdom responds. The giant's story warns against imagining that history can be undone by singular acts. It insists that transformation requires continuity, that learning unfolds across generations, not moments. That restraint, once internalized, becomes stronger than fear. As their influence recedes, the world feels lighter, not because memory is gone, but because it has been integrated. The land holds less tension. Communities move more freely. The future opens without denying the past. Stillness returns, but it is not the stillness of innocence. It is the stillness of understanding. Wind passes through valleys once marked by excess. Stone remains where rebellion once stood tall. The earth no longer strains under disproportionate weight. Yet this quiet does not mark an end, because the giants were never the deepest problem. They were expressions of it, visible consequences of a deeper fracture, one that began not with size but with desire. Not with strength but with transgression. As the giants fade into history, attention shifts naturally toward the source of imbalance itself, toward those who crossed boundaries first, toward the unseen decisions that set consequence in motion long before flesh took form. The lesson of the giants lingers. What is unleashed cannot always be recalled, but it can be restrained, it can be taught, it can be outgrown. And with that lesson settled into memory, the story moves closer to the deeper reckoning, where responsibility is traced not to visible excess but to the origins of permission itself. The land is quiet now, but the deeper questions are stirring. They are no longer about giants, they are about choice. Later traditions speak of the Watchers with a different tone than they speak of the giants. Not fear, not confrontation, but sorrow. These traditions do not dwell on punishment in vivid detail. They do not celebrate downfall. Instead, they speak quietly of regret, not repentance that restores, but recognition that something irreversible has occurred. A sorrow that does not seek absolution because it knows the shape of the world has already been altered. The Watchers' actions could not be undone. They had crossed a boundary that was never arbitrary. It existed not to withhold knowledge, but to preserve order. When that boundary was breached, the world changed configuration. History bent. Flesh took on forms it was never meant to bear. This regret is not portrayed as dramatic anguish. It is heavier than that. It is the still grief of understanding too late. The Watchers are remembered not as villains delighting in chaos, but as tragic figures, beings who misjudged their own limits. Knowledge misused, authority misplaced, desire outrunning wisdom. In this framing, their fall is not triumphant justice. It is a loss of role, loss of trust, loss of harmony between heaven and earth. And the giants remain as monuments to that error. Their bodies carry the memory of a decision that cannot be reversed. Their existence stands as evidence that once creation is reshaped, it cannot be returned to its original form by regret alone. Power, once exercised beyond restraint, leaves traces that sorrow cannot erase. This adds another layer to survival. The giants are no longer only witnesses for humanity. They may also be witnesses for heaven itself. Living reminders of why boundaries exist at all, why observation must remain observation, why authority must remain aligned with wisdom. Signature element, a regret that cannot repair, only remember. The tradition suggests that the Watcher's sorrow is not loud. It does not plead for restoration. It watches history unfold, knowing that its own choices helped shape what now must be managed rather than undone. In this light, allowance becomes pedagogical, not indulgence, not failure, but learning. Judgment restores balance, but learning requires memory, and memory requires something to remain. The giants remain not because heaven delights in their presence, but because erasure would also erase the lesson. Their continued existence teaches both realms, human and heavenly, that transgression carries weight beyond intention. The world moves forward, but it does not forget. And neither, it seems, do the Watchers. They still watch, not with authority, but with awareness. seeing in the giants the cost of misaligned desire, seeing in humanity the slow work of restraint. The tragedy is complete not when punishment falls, but when permanence is understood, and that understanding settles like dust over both heaven and earth, shaping everything that follows. Regret, when it arrives too late, carries a different gravity. The later traditions that speak of the Watchers do not imagine them pleading for forgiveness in ways that undo consequence. There is no return to the former station, no restoration to original purpose. What remains is awareness, a clear sight of what their actions released into the world, and an understanding that no act of sorrow can reverse it. This awareness is the punishment. The Watchers see what their knowledge became once separated from restraint. They see authority mirrored back at them through the giants, magnified, distorted, and burdened by excess. What they intended to share became something that could not be governed. This is why their regret is quiet. Loud remorse seeks change. Quiet regret recognizes permanence. Ancient memory frames this not as divine cruelty, but as consequence even heaven does not bypass. Order, once fractured, must be restored through time rather than negation. The cosmos itself operates under structure. Boundaries exist not only for humanity, but for all who bear power. In this way, the giants serve as witnesses beyond Earth. They stand as evidence that boundary crossing reshapes reality in ways even divine authority chooses not to simply erase. Their existence demonstrates that restraint, once broken, cannot be reasserted without residue. This realization deepens the meaning of allowance. If the giants remain, they remain not only for human instruction, but for cosmic memory. They testify that wisdom must govern power, and that knowledge divorced from alignment produces outcomes no realm desires. The Watcher's fall is therefore framed as tragedy, not spectacle. No triumph song follows it. There is no celebration in the text that all is now right. Instead, there is silence. Watching, waiting. Judgment has restored balance, but not innocence. And this distinction matters. Innocence belongs to beginnings. Balance belongs to maturity. The world after the flood is no longer innocent. It is learning, and learning requires reminders. The giants are those reminders. Their presence is heavy but purposeful. They embody the cost of misused authority. They demonstrate that power cannot act without consequence, even when intention is mixed or curiosity sincere. The Watchers, now stripped of role, become observers of a different kind. They no longer guide. They witness the slow unfolding of restraint in a world they help destabilize. Some traditions suggest that watching is itself a form of discipline, to see what might have been avoided. To watch humanity struggle, choose, fail, and learn under conditions shaped by their earlier transgression. This watching is not hopeless. It is instructive. It teaches that order is precious, that wisdom must lead to desire, that authority without humility fractures creation. The giants, then, are not merely scars of human history. They are memorials of cosmic misalignment. Their endurance presses a lesson upward as much as downward. In this light, allowance becomes necessary. Without memory, repetition is inevitable. Without visible consequence, boundary feels optional. The giants ensure neither realm forgets why limits exist. As time passes, their role shifts. They become less present physically but more embedded symbolically. Their story circulates long after their bodies recede. Regret settles into teaching. The Watcher's sorrow does not end the narrative. It deepens it. It reframes the flood not as correction alone, but as the beginning of a long education for heaven and earth alike. And as this education continues, attention moves gradually away from visible monuments toward the subtler work of law, memory, and restraint, forces that will shape the future more decisively than giants ever could. The world is quieter now, but it is listening more carefully. Regret, once accepted, becomes a form of silence, not emptiness, but restraint held inward. The Watchers in later memory are no longer figures of action. They do not intervene. They do not instruct. They remain present only as awareness, beings who now understand the cost of having acted too soon, too far, too confidently. Their regret cannot be repaired. It can only remember. This remembering gives shape to everything that follows. The cosmos itself seems to slow, as though learning to move more carefully after having felt how easily balance can fracture. Judgment has restored order, but wisdom must now preserve it, and wisdom grows slowly. The giants remain during this time not as living threats but as living records. They are monuments to a moment when knowledge outran wisdom, when desire outran responsibility. Their bodies carry the weight of that imbalance more honestly than words ever could. In this way, the giants serve a dual purpose. To humanity, they are reminders of consequence. To heaven, they are reminders of limits. The Watcher's regret does not demand erasure of what they caused. It accepts that erasure would deny reality. What exists must be dealt with, not denied. And so allowance becomes part of discipline. Memory becomes part of justice. Judgment restores balance, but learning requires memory, and memory requires something to remain. The giants remain long enough for this lesson to settle, not forever, not without restraint, but long enough. As time passes, their presence becomes less necessary. Humanity grows more practiced in restraint. Law takes root, covenant structures behavior. The world begins to operate within limits that no longer need constant reminders of excess. At the same time, the Watcher's regret transforms into watchfulness of a different kind, not supervision but observation shaped by loss. They see what humanity is learning, slowly, unevenly, but genuinely. They see restraint becoming internal rather than enforced. This is the quiet resolution of tragedy. No reversal, no restoration of what was, but growth. The giants, once embodiments of unchecked power, lose relevance in a world that has learned to value limits. They fade not because they are defeated, but because the conditions that sustain them no longer exist. Their story does not end with destruction. It ends with obsolescence, and that ending is intentional. Because the deepest lesson is not that transgression will be punished, but that misalignment will eventually lose its place in an ordered world. What cannot live within the boundary cannot endure where the boundary is honored. The Watcher's regret stands as confirmation of this truth. Even heaven learns that power must submit to wisdom. Even authority must respect limits. Even desire must wait. This mutual learning reshapes the cosmos. The world moves forward quieter, steadier. Not innocent but instructed, not perfect but restrained. The scars remain, but they no longer ache. They inform rather than inflame. Wind moves across lands once marked by excess. Stone remembers but does not resist. The sky stretches wide again, not compromised but clear. And in this stillness, something new becomes visible. The importance of law, not as restriction but as protection. Not as a burden but as a structure that allows life to flourish without repeating old wounds. Law emerges not as punishment but as a promise, an agreement between heaven and earth that the boundary will be honored, so memory does not have to keep teaching through pain. The Watcher's story fades into quiet sorrow. The giant's story fades into lessons. What remains is a world ready to live within limits rather than test them endlessly. And as this readiness settles, the narrative shifts, away from regret and consequence, toward the frameworks that will hold the future steady. Because after memory has done its work, something must replace it, something visible, something binding, something that ensures restraint is no longer learned only through loss. The silence deepens, the world listens, and from that listening the next movement begins, one shaped not by giants or watchers but by law, covenant, and the refusal to start over again. After the flood, something irreversible settles into the structure of the world. It is not only water that recedes, it is a method. Ancient memory marks this moment carefully. A covenant is established, not only with humanity but with creation itself. The promise is not abstract. It is specific and final. The world will not be reset this way again. No second deluge, no return to total erasure. This changes everything. From this point forward, consequence must be carried rather than washed away. History will no longer be undone by catastrophe. What exists must be managed, restrained, and lived through. Judgment, having once acted globally, now commits to patience. The sign of this shift is quiet but deliberate, a bow placed in the clouds, not a weapon released but suspended, strength curved downward, tension held without release, restraint made visible. The sky itself bears witness that power will now pause before it destroys. Signature element, a bow in the clouds, restraint made visible. This covenant reframes survival. It confirms that allowance is no longer temporary mercy. It is the operating principle of the world going forward. What remains must be handled within law. The continued existence of the giants fits this framework precisely. They are not erased because erasure has been renounced as a method. They are not unleashed because restraint now governs. They exist under limit, confined, diminishing, accounted for, managed within law rather than eliminated by catastrophe. This is maturity. The world no longer relies on reset. It relies on structure. Boundaries are no longer enforced through destruction but through continuity. Memory and law now share the work judgment once did alone. Judgment itself matures here. It no longer acts by ending everything that fails. It acts by limiting what fails so that everything else can endure. This is a quieter justice but a heavier one. It requires discernment rather than fear, faithfulness rather than survival instinct. Allowing the giants to exist under law avoids repeating destruction. It prevents the world from becoming dependent on catastrophe for correction. It places responsibility where it belongs, on daily obedience rather than divine reset. The story grows quieter at this point, but it also grows heavier. Because without the option of starting over, humanity must live with what it has learned, or repeat what it has refused to learn. The bow remains overhead. The clouds move slowly. And beneath them, a world begins to understand that restraint is no longer temporary. It is permanent, and permanent restraint demands something deeper than fear, discernment. With the covenant in place, the world enters a new phase of existence, one defined not by interruption but by endurance. The refusal to start over again is not abandonment. It is trust. Heaven entrusts the future to continuity rather than catastrophe. The promise carried in the clouds declares that destruction will no longer be the primary teacher. Instead, life will be shaped by limits honored over time. This is a heavier gift than rescue. To live without the threat of reset means that mistakes must be faced, not erased. Consequences must be navigated, not drowned. Memory must remain active, not submerged. The world is allowed to mature rather than be repeatedly undone. Law emerges here not as restriction but as architecture. It holds what once collapsed. It guides what once rushed. It limits what once expanded without wisdom. The giants exist within this architecture. They are no longer problems to be solved by force but realities to be managed by discernment. Their continued presence under law demonstrates the shift clearly. Power is no longer met with greater power but with boundary. They are contained geographically, contained historically, contained symbolically. Their existence proves that the covenant is being kept, not by removing every threat but by preventing the threat from becoming total. The world learns that safety does not require emptiness. It requires structure. This requires a different kind of faith. Faith that does not ask for erasure. Faith that accepts tension. Faith that believes restraint can hold even when fear still appears. The bow in the clouds is not a promise that nothing difficult will return. It is a promise that difficulty will no longer consume everything. Chaos has lost its permission to spread without limit. Judgment has changed posture. Where it once acted decisively to prevent collapse, it now acts patiently to prevent recurrence. It does not hover with constant threat. It stands with visible reminders. Every time clouds gather without flooding the earth, the covenant is renewed silently. The world remembers that restraint is active even when fear suggests otherwise. This reshapes humanity's role. No longer can people wait for catastrophe to correct corruption. They must recognize imbalance early. They must choose obedience before excess demands intervene. Law becomes a daily practice rather than an emergency measure. The giant's gradual fatting under this system confirms the wisdom of the shift. What is restrained rather than erased loses influence naturally. Time, guided by law, accomplishes what destruction once did abruptly. The story grows quieter here because spectacle is no longer needed, but it grows heavier because responsibility cannot be deferred. Without the option of starting over, every choice carries greater weight. Memory matters, discernment matters, faithfulness matters. The world begins to understand that restraint is not weakness. It is commitment, a refusal to abandon creation simply because it has been wounded. The bow remains, silent, curved, waiting. And beneath it, humanity learns that the future will not be rescued from its own decisions. It must be shaped by them. The covenant does not rush the world toward resolution. It settles in. Season after season passes beneath the same sky. Rain falls and stops without becoming a catastrophe. Rivers swell and recede without consuming everything in their path. Life continues within boundaries that are no longer provisional. This continuity is the true test. A world without reset must learn patience. It must learn how to live with unresolved tension without demanding erasure. The refusal to start over again forces maturity not only upon humanity but upon history itself. The giants exist within this long patience. They are no longer symbols of impending collapse. They are reminders of how collapse was once prevented and why it will not be repeated. Their presence under law affirms that catastrophe is not the solution to imbalance. Restraint is. A bow in the clouds, restraint made visible. Each time it appears, it speaks without words. Power remains, but it is curved. Authority remains, but it is held back. Judgment remains, but it has chosen endurance over erasure. This reshapes how fear functions. Fear no longer signals the end of the world. It becomes information. A warning that imbalance still exists, but that law stands ready to contain it. Humanity learns not to panic in the presence of difficulty, but to respond with discernment shaped by memory. The giants over time become less threatening not because they weaken dramatically, but because the world around them stabilizes. Boundaries become cultural rather than catastrophic. Law becomes habitual rather than reactive. They are managed within law, not erased by catastrophe. This management allows the world to grow quieter, spectacle fades, crisis recedes. What remains is the slow work of faithfulness, less visible but more demanding. The heaviness of this era lies in its lack of shortcuts. Without reset, there is no dramatic rescue to anticipate. There is only a daily choice, obedience practiced in ordinary moments, discernment applied before fear escalates. This is the world judgment has chosen to trust. The covenant binds heaven to patience and humanity to responsibility. Neither can retreat into absolutes. Both must participate in restraint. The giants fade as a result of this shared commitment. Their relevance diminishes because the conditions that sustain them no longer exist. Excess finds no permission. Imbalance finds no space to grow. Their disappearance is not celebrated. It is absorbed. What remains is not victory but stability. The land breathes more easily. Communities settle without constant fear of annihilation. Memory remains, but it no longer dominates imagination. It informs quietly, guiding without shouting. The story continues, but it does so without spectacle. And in this quieter world, attention shifts once more, away from giants and floods, away from visible consequences, toward something subtler. Because if catastrophe will not come again to reset the world, then the most significant dangers will no longer announce themselves through size or terror. They will arrive quietly within the structures meant to preserve order. And the next question emerges, not about destruction but about discernment. How will the law be upheld? How will restraint be maintained? How will memory remain active without becoming a burden? The bow remains in the sky. The clouds pass without judgment, and beneath them the world prepares to face a different kind of trial, one not defined by giants but by the fragile balance of obedience sustained over time. The giants do not leave the world the way they entered it. There is no final clash recorded, no last stand that seals their fate, no moment when the earth shakes and announces their end. They fade. Ancient records grow thinner as generations pass. Where once names were spoken with urgency, they are later mentioned only in lists. Where fear once dominated entire communities, it softens into caution, then into memory. The giants do not disappear all at once. They recede unevenly, quietly, almost patiently. This absence is not accidental. It is earned. Time does the work catastrophe once did. Obedience, practiced consistently rather than desperately, reshapes the world around them. Boundaries once newly enforced become habitual. What once required vigilance becomes instinct. The giants find less space to exist. Their territories shrink as settlements grow confident. Their names shorten as stories compress. Anakim becomes ancestry. Rephaim becomes reference. What was once immediate becomes historical. Fear follows the same path. It does not vanish, but it loosens its grip. Communities no longer measure every future possibility against the giants' presence. They plan beyond them. They imagine without them. The giants cease to define the horizon. Signature element, footprints ending at the edge of history. This is how ancient memory records their disappearance, not as erasure but as boundary reached. Their story runs until it cannot run any farther. The world no longer supports what they represent. What violates order cannot endure indefinitely in a structured world. This is the quiet verdict history delivers. The giants were never meant to last. Their survival was temporary by design. They remained long enough to teach restraint, long enough to force memory into the bones of culture. Once that memory settled, their presence became unnecessary. Survival was temporary. Memory was permanent. The land absorbs their absence without relief or celebration. Fields grow where fear once stalled movement. Roads pass through regions once avoided. Stone still remembers, but it no longer resists. The giant's fading confirms something essential about judgment and time. Not everything must be destroyed to end. Some things simply lose their place. The world matures past them. This maturity is not dramatic. It is quite competence. A confidence shaped by restraint rather than dominance. The giants become incompatible with a world that has learned how to live within limits. And so they pass out of immediacy into record. What remains are traces, footprints that stop. Names that echo briefly then settle. The story does not mourn them. It does not celebrate them. It lets them go. And as their shadow recedes fully into history, a different kind of silence takes hold. One that feels final not because something was destroyed, but because something has completed its purpose. The giants are gone, but the meaning of their survival remains, waiting to be understood more fully. As the giants fade, what remains becomes clearer. History does not rush to replace them with new terrors. There is no immediate substitute. No creature rises to take their place. Instead, there is space. An unfamiliar openness where fear once stood ready. This space reveals how much the world has changed. The disappearance of the giants is not marked by relief alone, but by orientation. Communities no longer define themselves in opposition to overwhelming threats. They begin to measure success by stability rather than survival. Fields are planted with confidence they will be harvested. Children are taught futures that extend beyond fear. Records reflect this shift quietly. Where once detailed accounts described stature, strength, and intimidation, later writings grow brief. A name appears without explanation. A region is mentioned without warning. The giants become background rather than foreground. Their presence no longer organizes the story. This thinning is significant. Ancient writers understood that what deserves a detailed record is what still exerts power. When influence wanes, description follows. The giants' gradual erasure from narrative attention signals that they no longer shape decision-making. They no longer govern imagination. Footprints ending at the edge of history. The metaphor holds because the trail is visible until it stops. No sudden drop. No dramatic vanishing. Just the clear point where movement ends. The giants walked until the world no longer allowed the next step. Boundary keeping did this. Law held firm, memory remained active, obedience became ordinary rather than reactive. The conditions that once sustained disproportionate power dissolved slowly until excess had nowhere to stand. This teaches something subtle but essential. What violates order does not always need confrontation to be defeated. Often, it needs consistency to be outgrown. Chaos collapses when structure endures. Excess weakens when the limit remains patient. The giant's disappearance is therefore not a victory over enemies but a triumph of order, a demonstration that the world once stabilized can heal without repeating violence. Survival had been temporary. Memory remained permanent. This permanence matters. Even as fear recedes, remembrance guards against return. The giants are gone, but their story is preserved, not to haunt but to anchor. Future generations inherit caution without inheriting terror. The land itself reflects this change. Paths cross places once avoided. Stone that once felt heavy now feels ordinary. The earth no longer resists settlement in the same way, as though tension has finally released. Yet this release is not forgetful. It is integration. The giant's fatting teaches that some threats end not because they are destroyed, but because they are understood fully enough to lose authority. When meaning is extracted, presence is no longer required. This is a quieter ending than destruction, but a stronger one, because what is destroyed can be rebuilt. What is outgrown does not return. As the giants slip fully into the past, attention begins to shift, not toward what once frightened humanity, but toward what must now sustain it. Without visible monsters, the burden of discernment grows heavier. The world must learn to recognize imbalance before it becomes embodied. To address corruption while it is still subtle, the absence of giants is not the end of the challenge. It is the beginning of responsibility. And in this widening silence, a final question begins to form, one that no longer asks how fear disappears, but why memory must endure even when fear has gone. When the giants finally pass beyond living memory, the world does not feel empty. It feels steadier. Silence settles over the places once marked by disproportion. Highlands that once carried fear now carry wind alone. Valleys open without hesitation. The land breathes as though released from a long-held tension, not because it has forgotten, but because it no longer resists. This is the final stage of fatting. The giants do not vanish from record entirely. Their names remain, but they lose immediacy. They are no longer warnings shouted in the present tense. They become lessons spoken softly, framed by distance. History absorbs them without urgency. Footprints ending at the edge of history. The image is precise. Their trace remains until the moment it does not. Beyond that line, there is no continuation, no inheritance of scale, no revival of presence. What once walked the land cannot walk forward into a world reshaped by restraint. This teaches a quiet but decisive truth. What violates order cannot endure indefinitely in a structured world. Not because it is hunted relentlessly, but because the structure itself is inhospitable to excess. A world governed by limits slowly erodes what requires imbalance to survive. Over time, disproportion becomes unsustainable. The giants were strong, but strength alone could not carry them into the future. They were too rigid to adapt, too rooted in a past that no longer defined reality. As the world matured, they lost relevance, not through defeat but through incompatibility. Survival, it becomes clear, was never meant to be permanent. It was temporary, long enough to instruct, long enough to embed memory where it could not be ignored, long enough for humanity to internalize the cost of excess without needing constant confrontation. Memory, however, was meant to last, and it does. The giant's story remains as a boundary marker in collective consciousness. It teaches that power divorced from restraint consumes itself. That history does not repeat exactly, but it does rhyme when memory is neglected. This memory now serves a different function. No longer warning of towering figures on the horizon, it guards against subtler dangers, temptations to overreach, to justify excess, to mistake ability for permission. The giant's absence sharpens discernment rather than dulls it. The world moves forward quieter than before, but more attentive. Fields grow where fear once hesitated. Roads cross lands once avoided. The earth accepts human presence without strain. Life proceeds within a rhythm that does not require constant correction. Yet this calm carries weight, because without giants there is no obvious enemy to blame. Responsibility settles inward. The next threats will not announce themselves through size or terror. They will emerge through choice, ambition, forgetfulness. And so the disappearance of the giants does not conclude the story. It prepares it. The footprints stop. The path continues. What once stood as an embodied consequence now lives as memory alone. And memory, when honored, becomes protection rather than burden. The land rests. The sky remains clear. But the final question draws near, not about what disappeared, but about why it was allowed to remain long enough to teach. The answer to that question has been forming quietly across every chapter. And now, with the giants fully behind us, the story turns toward that answer, toward the meaning hidden beneath survival itself, waiting to be named. They were allowed because erasure teaches less than restraint. This is the conclusion ancient memory arrives at slowly, almost reluctantly, not as a declaration shouted from heaven, but as an understanding that settles after generations of observation. What disappears too quickly leaves little wisdom behind. What is restrained, endured, and outgrown teaches more deeply than what is simply removed. The Nephilim remain not as victors, but as questions given time. Their survival was never framed as a reward. It was framed as a burden, a weight carried forward so that forgetting would not be easy. Because a world protected from memory is a world doomed to repeat rebellion. Oblivion feels merciful, but it is shallow. It removes pain without removing the tendency. Restraint, by contrast, preserves awareness. It allows humanity to live with the evidence of what excess produces without being consumed by it. This is why consequence instructs where erasure cannot. The giants embodied a question rather than an answer. Their presence asked again and again, what happens when power outruns wisdom? Each generation encountered that question in a new form. Some recoiled, some confronted it, some learned slowly. Signature element, a question heavier than an answer. The weight of that question shaped humanity more than the giants themselves ever could. Fear forced reflection. Memory demanded discernment. The absence of easy erasure required maturity. The giants were allowed to remain because history needed time, time to process, time to internalize, time to learn that obedience is not proven by the absence of threat, but by the presence of restraint. In the quiet after their passing, humanity was left with choice. Not the choice to dominate or submit to giants, but the deeper choice to live within limits without needing visible reminders of excess. The giants were never meant to last. Their fatting confirms that. But the lesson was meant to endure. The lesson that power must wait for wisdom, that knowledge must submit to restraint. Those boundaries exist not to diminish life, but to preserve it. As the giants receded fully into memory, humanity carried forward what mattered most, not fear but understanding. And this understanding did not close the story. It opened responsibility. Because once memory has done its work, the burden shifts inward. No towering figures remain to absorb blame. No visible monsters remain to define danger. What remains is choice, quiet, daily, unremarkable, and decisive. The land rests. The sky remains unchanged. And beneath that calm, the final truth becomes clear. The Nephilim were allowed not because corruption was tolerated, but because wisdom requires time to grow roots deeper than fear. The question they embodied has been answered, not with words but with history itself. The allowance of the giants reshapes how responsibility is understood. Once the visible threat fades, nothing external remains to absorb blame. No towering presence stands at the edge of the land to explain fear or justify compromise. The world becomes quieter, but also more exposed. This exposure is intentional. If erasure had been complete, humanity might have mistaken silence for innocence. The absence of consequence would have suggested that rebellion leaves no lasting imprint, but restraint tells a different story. It allows memory to mature into wisdom rather than fear, because consequence instructs where oblivion cannot. The Nephilim remain long enough for humanity to learn that power is not self-justifying. That strength without alignment collapses inward. That dominance eventually exhausts the ground it stands upon. These truths do not root quickly. They require time lived under tension. This is why the giants were not removed all at once. Their gradual fatting mirrors the gradual growth of discernment. As fear diminished, responsibility increased. Humanity could no longer point outward. It had to look inward, toward desire, ambition, forgetfulness. A question heavier than an answer. The question the giants embodied did not resolve when they disappeared. It followed humanity into quieter spaces, into councils rather than battlefields, into lawmaking rather than survival, into daily choices that carried no spectacle. Would power be restrained when no giant demanded it? Would obedience remain when fear was gone? These questions define the true test. The world, now structured by covenant and law, no longer relied on catastrophe to correct itself. It relied on memory carried forward consciously. The bow and the clouds no longer needed explanation. It had become understood. The giants had served their purpose, not as enemies defeated but as lessons completed. Their existence proved that survival alone does not equal victory. They survived, but they did not endure. What endures is what can live within limit. What endures is what adapts to restraint rather than resists it. Humanity learned this slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. And in that learning, something shifted. Fear lost its authority. Memory gained depth. Law became internal rather than imposed. The world began to govern itself with greater care. This is the quiet success of restraint. It does not announce itself. It does not celebrate loudly. It simply holds. The giants were allowed because the world needed time to become capable of holding wisdom without terror enforcing it. Time to grow past the need for visible reminders of excess. And once that time had passed, the giants were no longer necessary. They did not need to be destroyed again. They simply lost relevance. What remained was choice, unavoidable, unprotected, and profound. Choice now stood at the center of the story where giants once stood. And choice, unlike fear, does not shout, it waits. When the giants were gone, the world did not feel victorious. It felt responsible. There were no songs celebrating their absence. No monuments raised to mark the end of fear. Life simply continued, steadier, quieter, less dramatic. Fields were planted without hesitation. Paths were walked without scanning the horizon. The land no longer held its breath. And in that calm, the final meaning of allowance became clear. They were allowed because erasure teaches less than restraint, because consequence instructs where oblivion cannot, because a world protected from memory is a world doomed to repeat rebellion. The Nephilim were never meant to endure as rulers or threats. They were meant to endure as questions, questions heavy enough to slow history, to demand reflection, to force wisdom to grow roots deeper than fear. Signature element, a question heavier than an answer. That question did not ask whether giants should have existed. It asked what humanity would do once they no longer did. Without visible monsters, power would take subtler forms. Influence would move quietly. Desire would no longer announce itself through size or terror. The next dangers would not stand on hills or in borderlands. They would rise within councils, hearts, and choices made without witnesses. The giants were allowed so humanity could learn to recognize imbalance before it became embodied, to confront corruption while it was still small enough to be restrained without catastrophe, to live within limits not because fear demanded it, but because wisdom understood it. The giants were never meant to last, but the lesson was. In the quiet after their passing, humanity was left with choice. Not a single dramatic choice, but countless ordinary ones. Choices made in peace rather than panic. Choices that could not be blamed on overwhelming force. choices that revealed alignment more clearly than fear ever could. This is where the story finally rests, not in terror, not in spectacle, but in discernment. The land is calm now. Rivers move within their banks. Stone holds warmth without memory of strain. The sky stretches wide, unbroken by threat. The bow in the clouds no longer needs explanation. It has become part of the world's understanding. And beneath that sky, humanity walks forward carrying something more enduring than strength. Memory, restraint. Wisdom is learned slowly. The Nephilim are gone, not erased, but completed. Their story remains as quiet guidance, that power without boundary consumes itself, and that what is restrained long enough can be outgrown. The earth breathes. The silence holds. And in that stillness, the final truth settles gently into place, preparing the ground for the deeper questions that follow, questions not about giants or floods, but about how law, memory, and choice will shape the future when no visible warning remains.